Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that can be a real head scratcher in equine medicine.
Yeah, it definitely highlights how important it is to really think about those lab results and, not just take them at face value.
Right. Especially when you're dealing with something like rhabdomyolysis in horses.
Yep.
It can get pretty complicated.
Absolutely. And, rhabdomyolysis, for those who might need a refresher, is basically when you have the breakdown of muscle fibers.
And that can lead to a whole cascade of problems, right?
Oh, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. One of the things that can happen is you get this release of potassium from those damaged muscle cells.
And that potassium, it ends up in the bloodstream.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that's when you can run into hyperkalemia.
And that's not something you want to mess around with.
No, definitely not hyperkalemia. It can be life-threatening. Those high potassium levels, they really mess with the heart's electrical activity.
Yeah, you can get arrhythmias. And in some cases, it can even be fatal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's something you got to catch and you got to treat it aggressively.
So the article we're diving into today, it starts with a real interesting case. 3 horses, they all come in with the classic signs of rhabdomyolysis.
Yeah.
With stiffness, trouble moving, and that dark urine.
Yeah. And when they did blood work using the VetScan VS2 analyzer,
The one that's pretty common in a lot of practices.
yeah, that's the one. So the results, they showed these really high potassium levels.
So naturally, the vets, they're thinking hyperkalemia, right?
Of course. That's a major concern with rhabdomyolysis. So they started treatment right away.
Yeah. They went all in intravenous calcium dextrose, even clenbuterol, the whole 9 yards to get those potassium levels down.
But here's where it gets kind of strange.
Right. The treatments, they didn't seem to do much. And
Yeah.
get this,
All 3 horses, they ended up recovering from the rhabdomyolysis.
without any signs that they ever actually had serious hyperkalemia.
Yeah, no real complications related to high potassium at all. It was almost like those initial readings were a bit off.
And that's what got the vets thinking. Maybe something else was going on.
Right. They started to wonder if those high potassium levels were truly accurate, or if something else was interfering with the readings.
So they dug a little deeper, and that's where this research study comes in. They wanted to get to the bottom of this whole thing.
Yeah, and this study, it looked at 18 horses with rhabdomyolysis. They compared potassium readings from the VetScan VS2 to readings from other analyzers.
And those other analyzers, they used a different method called ion-specific electrodes.
Right, and those ion-specific electrodes, they're kind of the gold standard for potassium measurement. They're a lot less likely to be thrown off by other things in the blood.
So it's a more accurate picture of what's really going on.
Exactly. And what they found was pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, tell me more. What did they find?
The VetScan VS2, it consistently gave higher potassium readings than the ion-specific electrode analyzers,
And this was especially true in horses that had really high levels of muscle enzyme activity.
which makes sense. The more muscle damage there is, the more likely you are to see this discrepancy in the potassium readings.
So basically, it looked like the VetScan VS2 might be prone to giving these falsely high potassium readings in these cases.
Right, and they called it pseudohyperkalemia. It sounds
Oh.
pretty complicated, but basically it's like a false alarm.
The potassium levels look high, but they're not actually dangerously high.
Exactly. And the study, they have this really helpful figure, figure 1. It shows you the potassium readings from the 2 types of analyzers side by side.
So you can really see the difference, especially as the level of muscle enzyme activity goes up. That's measured by something called creatine kinase, or CK.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole thing so important, because if you're just relying on the VetScan VS2, you might think the horse has severe hyperkalemia and start treating them aggressively.
But in reality, they might not need all that treatment.
Exactly. And that's what happened with those first 3 horses.
Right. They got all those treatments, but they probably didn't actually need them.
And that brings up a really important question. Why is the VetScan VS2 giving these falsely elevated readings?
Well, it all comes down to how it measures potassium. The VetScan VS2, it uses this method that involves an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase, or LDH.
And LDH, that's also released from damaged muscle tissue during rhabdomyolysis.
So if you have a lot of LDH in the blood, it can actually interfere with how the VetScan measures potassium,
It's like the LDH is throwing off the results.
and that's what leads to those artificially high readings. That's the pseudohyperkalemia.
Exactly. And that's what can lead to misdiagnosis and unnecessary treatment.
And like you said before, that can have some serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely. It can be stressful for the horse, and it can be expensive for the owner.
And the article, it really highlights the impact this had on the owners of those first 3 horses. They went through a lot of worry and expense, all because of this technical issue with the testing method.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how important it is to be aware of these kinds of things.
And how easily things can get misinterpreted.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that we always need to be thinking critically about the information we're getting.
And not just blindly trust the numbers on a lab report.
Absolutely. Because sometimes those numbers, they don't tell the whole story.
Yeah.
That's the crux of the matter, you know. How common is this knowledge about pseudohyperkalemia among vets?
Right, because these cases in the article, they happened over a span of 10 years.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder if maybe there's a gap in awareness somewhere.
You know what's interesting, though, is that the resource package from Abaxis for the VetScan VS2.
It actually mentions this whole thing about falsely elevated potassium readings.
Oh, really?
Yeah, particularly in cases of like severe muscle trauma.
So the information's out there.
It is. They even recommend confirming those high potassium readings with a different method just to be sure.
So maybe it's not that vets don't know about it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just that it gets lost in the shuffle, you know?
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed with information sometimes.
But either way, this whole situation, it really shows you how important it is to think critically in vet med.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just rely on the numbers from a machine. You got to look at the whole picture.
Connect the dots. Use your brain.
Exactly. And the study, they actually have a specific recommendation to help avoid this whole pseudohyperkalemia trap.
Oh, what's that?
They say that in cases of rhabdomyolysis, you should use a different kind of analyzer to measure potassium.
One that uses ion-specific electrodes.
Right, because those analyzers are not affected by high LDH levels.
So they give you a more accurate reading of the potassium.
Exactly. And that can make a big difference because remember, true hyperkalemia, it can be really serious.
Yeah, you don't want to miss it if it's actually happening.
Exactly. So confirming those high potassium readings, it's crucial.
Just to be on the safe side.
Now, one thing I do want to mention is that just because you see pseudohyperkalemia,
It doesn't mean that all high potassium readings from the VetScan VS2 are wrong.
right, the study, they actually found one horse that had true hyperkalemia.
And it was confirmed by both the VetScan and a different analyzer that uses ion-selective electrodes.
Exactly. So it's not about ignoring the VetScan completely.
It's about being aware that it could be tricks sometimes.
Especially in cases with rhabdomyolysis.
So you got to double-check those results.
Exactly. Use your judgment. Look at the whole clinical picture.
Be a detective.
That's it. Exactly. You got to put all the pieces together, the history, the exam, the lab work.
And if something doesn't seem right,
You got to dig a little deeper.
ask more questions.
Exactly. Because in vet med, things aren't always what they seem.
This whole pseudohyperkalemia thing is a perfect example of that.
It's a good reminder that we can't get complacent.
We got to stay sharp. Keep learning.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, it's all about giving our patients the best possible care
And that starts with understanding the tools we're using.
and knowing their limitations.
So let's sum this up for our listeners. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is to be aware of this pseudohyperkalemia issue,
Especially in horses with rhabdomyolysis.
and especially if you're using the VetScan VS2.
Number 2, always confirm any high potassium readings that seem a little fishy.
Use a different method like an analyzer with ion-specific electrodes.
And number 3, always think critically about those lab results.
Don't just take them at face value. Look at the bigger picture.
Consider the whole patient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's how we make sure we're giving our horses the best possible care.
And you know what's amazing about this whole thing?
Yeah.
It really goes back to those 3 horses from the beginning.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They were like the pioneers, you know?
Right. They helped uncover this whole pseudohyperkalemia phenomenon without even knowing it.
Exactly. It just shows you that every case can teach us something.
Even when it seems like a straightforward rhabdomyolysis case.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that we can't just blindly trust those lab reports.
We had to use our brains. Think critically.
Especially when the results don't seem to match up with what we're seeing in the horse.
Right. If something feels off, don't be afraid to dig a little deeper.
Exactly. Ask questions, double-check things.
Because sometimes those initial results, they might not be telling the whole story.
And those 3 horses, their cases really highlight the importance of that.
They remind us to keep learning and questioning and always strive to be better.
Because that's what it's all about, right?
Absolutely. It's about being the best advocate for our patients.
And making sure they get the most accurate diagnosis and the most appropriate treatment.
So from Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light and tails wagging.